In this video, I'm going to be showing you the actual process of paper stretching, okay, and then also showing you what to do once you've paper stretched and done your painting, the process then as well. So for paper stretching, obviously we need our piece of paper, and you'll see I've done a little bit of preparation for this piece of paper in that I've drawn a border, 1 centimetre border around where I want my picture area to be, and the reason for that is so I know where to line my tape up onto. So I just find that makes securing the tape down onto the paper and the board that bit easier, because I've got a guide of where I want my tape to go. Obviously you can make your border larger if you want. I wouldn't make it any smaller than 1 centimetre. This is 1 centimetre, just so that there's a decent amount of area for the tape to grab onto. So this piece of paper is ready to be soaked in water. Now from this point onwards, I want to try and keep everything that I use clean. So first of all, I'll blow any dust or anything that's on the paper. I don't want anything to get to stain the actual surface of the paper, and all the equipment that I use and my hands, I want everything to be clean so nothing gets on the picture area. And I do, you'll notice I will try my best not to touch this central area of the paper, because I don't want that to get damaged or, as I say, stained before I paint on it. Okay, so I need some water, and here I've got a tray of water. You can use a sink, you can use a bath if you want, if you've got a large piece of paper. The main thing, as I mentioned, make sure whatever you use is clean, clean of dirt, and also clean of any cleaning products, well, anything that might get onto the paper. And also just make sure it is large enough for the paper to lay flat. Okay, so you want the paper to lay entirely flat. You don't want paper to have to be bent in order to fit into it, because you want the paper, as I mentioned in the first video, you've seen that you want the paper to be soaked evenly like that, and you also don't want it to get bent home. The whole point of this is to keep the paper flat. Okay, so you put cold water in there, just in case you're wondering. And now we're going to place the paper inside, and I just try and touch the edges, not the center, make sure it's fully immersed. And you can allow that to soak for about 10 to 20 minutes. Try not to make it longer than that. If you go for half an hour, and you're potentially damaging the paper permanently. So 10 to 20 minutes is fine. If you've got heavier paper, 400, 500, you might go towards the 20-minute end. If you've got lighter paper, like this is 220, 10 minutes, and so on. But as long as you're within that window, that's fine. Any longer than that is potentially damaging. Any shorter than that, you're not necessarily soaking the paper fully. Okay, so I'm going to put that aside, but and allow that to soak whilst I explain some of the rest of the process. The next thing you need is a board, ideally a piece of wooden board or thick wooden panelling. You essentially want something that isn't going to be affected by being made wet several times. So you want something that won't get warped over time, and can keep its shape. So in these times of having to adapt and make to amend to a certain degree, then you might consider, for example, a chopping board. Could, if you had a spare one, for example, could be used for the task. You want something that the tape can grip to, so don't use glass or plastic or anything like that. As I say, you can get wooden drawing boards or art boards from art shops or online, so that would suffice. The boards that we used at House of Illustration, actually they were MDF for the reasons that we had to get a lot of them, and MDF is a bit cheaper, and MDF can be used, but you must prepare it first. So raw MDF isn't suitable because it can get affected by water. So if you use MDF, you must also prepare it with a sealer. So for example, here is an acrylic base quick drying MDF clear sealer. So you paint it onto the board, a couple of coats I would recommend, and then leave it to dry for several days in my experience. With a sealer, it can remain tacky for quite some time, and when wet paper dries on it, it can stick to it, but eventually it'll be dry enough and can be used, and they work perfectly fine, but you do have to take that time to prepare it properly. So if you can get access to a wooden sheet of wooden board, then all the better, I think. So you need a wooden board, and then you also need your art tape, as mentioned in the previous video. Now normally these they're often about this big, last a long time, and aren't particularly expensive, and again can available in all good art shops or online. So as previously I said, gum tape, art gum tape or watercolour gum tape, those are the names it can come under. This, I've used a lot of this, as you can see. So what's good to do is to pre-cut the strips that you need, and you want your strip lengths to be a little bit longer than the length of the sheet of paper that you're wanting to cover. I usually go about 3 centimeters each side, a bit longer, something like that. You'll see that in action in a moment. So have your tape pre-cut and ready to stick down when the paper has soaked for long enough. Okay, so have those ready, and the other thing you will require is a bowl of clean water here, and a clean sponge. This might not look very clean, it's just been stained because it's been used for face painting, but it's a very has been thoroughly cleaned and won't affect the papers. So a clean sponge and clean water, and just put those to the side for a moment whilst we get our paper. So that's what's required. Put our board down. Now let's look at our paper. Here should have soaked for long enough. So as I say, 10 to 20 minutes, and I'm going to now lift this out. So I'm just holding it carefully at the corner, and at this point you just want to get rid of any excess surface water. So I'm just gently bobbing it up and down to encourage drops of water to come off. I don't have to do it vigorously. I certainly don't want to shake it in case I damage it, so I'm just bobbing it up and down. And then just to ensure that the paper remains evenly wet, I tend to grab the other corner like that, and then allow any remaining excess surface water to go the opposite corner that I've just been holding, like so, and just do that for a minute or so. As it slows down dripping and stops, then you can take that as your cue to take it away. So we'll put water away, we'll bring the board back into play, and I'm being very careful not to touch the paper in the center, my picture area, and laying the paper down as straight as I can using the edge of the board to help me lay it straight. If you're very conscious about getting it particularly straight on the board, then you might already have marked out a line where you want the paper to lay down. As you can see, I've made a little mucky mark there accidentally. Do be careful to keep everything clean, but because I know that's on my border, it's not a problem. So that's where this line really helps in encouraging me to just know where to hold it. So if I happen to have dirty finger, it's not on the picture area. The picture area remains clean. So let's get our bits of tape. I'm not going to tape the whole thing right now, that would take too long, make our video a bit too long, but I'll do a couple of strips. So I've got my water there, just put that there, bring this here, and I'll take one of my strips, and I just want to hold it like this. I want to get my sponge, I want my sponge to be wet without being dripping wet, but not damp either. I want it to be wet. I want that gum on that tape to definitely get activated by the water. And what I would do is press the sponge against the gum side, like so, and put my thumb on the non-gum side, and then just run the sponge down the tape, straighten that tape out, and I would do that right down the length about 3 times. Make sure that the gum is nice, sort of glistening wet, not dripping, glistening wet. Also, just where my finger's just been, just make sure that's been wetted as it needs to be, and then I can place it on the paper. And this is where my border becomes really helpful. It just makes me confident in knowing exactly where I want the tape to be. And there we go. And it's there all the way down. And what I'm doing here now is just making sure there are no air pockets, making sure the tape is thoroughly stuck to the board. I tend to run my finger or thumb right up to the edge of the paper, get rid of any air pockets there so it's nicely secure, and then run quite firmly along the edge of the paper like so, and that feels nice and secure there. So I can go for another strip of paper, and I'm just going to do this horizontal length. You can see how the tape just a few centimeters top and bottom spare there, and that just helps to keep it secure onto the board. So just get my sponge again, go in there, squeeze it, any dripping water off, but making sure the sponge is still wet, and running the sponge down the gum part. Shouldn't do that over the paper. I don't want any drops to get on the paper, so just be careful there. And then placing the paper along that border there like that. It's quite satisfying, this part, I find. And there we go, and it's sticking nicely to the board. Run my finger along that edge, run my finger along there, and throughout just making sure I'm not touching the picture area at all. And I do that to the other parts, and I should end up with something. Let's lift that up like this. Okay. Now once I've got my pieces of tape down, I want it then to dry. It should take several hours to dry. I tend to just let it dry overnight to be sure that it's fully dry before I start painting on it. Do not try and force dry it at all, like put it next to something hot. For example, you could put it next to a radiator like this. The danger of that is forcing it to dry. It can cause it to warp and dry unevenly. So if you've got a heat source here, for example, this will dry quicker than this part. So you don't want to put it near anything hot. Just leave it in a dry room and just let it dry over a lengthy period of time so it dries nice and evenly. So like I say, let it go overnight so that you can be sure it's dry the next morning. You might think, oh, it's an awfully long time to have to wait to be able to paint. Sometimes I can't be that, prepared. I can't think, oh, I want to paint and then go, oh, I have to wait till the next morning to actually do something. Well, what I tend to do, it helps if you've got a few boards, a few surfaces that you can stretch paper onto, is have a few already stretched. So whenever I have an inclination to paint, an impulse to paint, there's one there to use, should I be doing pictures that require a stretched piece of paper. So it's good to just do a few and have them ready to paint on. Okay, so once you've done that and once you've painted on it, what next? How do we get our image off the board? Well, it's pretty simple and straightforward to do. And let me just get an example. So, a couple of things to consider when you're removing your piece of paper. First thing you do, what it involves, both ways involves just cutting the paper off from the board. Don't try and remove the image with the tape or tearing that off. The easiest thing is to just cut the image out. That way you don't damage it, you don't bend it. You can go to all that trouble to have a flat image and then try and tear it all off and accidentally bend it. There's no point in risking that. So the simplest way to do it is just to cut it out. So you can cut out just the picture area like this, and you can do that with a craft knife like so. Make sure they're nice sharp and a ruler, and you can just cut it out and lift it out, and again, something that's very satisfying to see your image coming out away from the border like so. Okay, the other thing you can do is cut the image out, cut the whole of the paper out, so that you end up with a border of tape like so. And you might be thinking, oh, why on earth would I want a border of that tape around there? Well, some people keep the tape on there because it actually acts as a bit of protection for the edges of your image, because it reinforces the edge like that. So some people keep that on for that purpose. But then you might think, but when I'm displaying that, I don't want people to see that. Well, if you think about it, if you frame your imagery, you would usually, particularly watercolor images, usually put it beneath a mount first of all, and the mount can be cut so as to cover the taped area, so you wouldn't actually see it when your image is on display. And you may well have seen a lot of watercolor paintings on display and not realized that beneath the mount there is actually some gum tape underneath, like so. Okay, so two options: cut around the picture area or cut around the whole of the paper for a bit of added protection, like so. You might think, I'll just bring that over a minute, you might think, oh, isn't it possible to get the tape off there so you have a white border? It is possible to a degree. You can soak the tape, very carefully paint water on it and start scraping it away with your fingernail or thumbnail or knife or with a scraper, but it's not worth the risk. It's so easy if you could damage what you've painted, get that wet and start marking it in a way that you don't want to. You can also start warping the paper because you're wetting an edge of the paper. It can start to affect that edge of the paper, and you've gone to all that trouble to keep it flat, and then you start going against that for the sake of a little white border. So I wouldn't recommend it. Okay. There we go. Now, what about the board afterwards? What about getting the tape off the board? That here you can soak and scrape, and that's fine once your picture is out of the way. So first thing you can try doing is seeing if the tape simply just tears off, and sometimes it will do you the courtesy of just coming straight off like that. If it's not doing that, then you want to soak it. So get a sponge and just give it a good thorough soaking. Don't be afraid to make it very wet. Wetter it is, easier it comes off. Again, it's worth just seeing if anything can be torn off first, and quite often you'll see it comes off in layers, so you might have to re-soak like that once you've torn off maybe a top layer like that. Ooh, this is coming off almost too well. Then it might get to a point where it won't won't tear off, so that's where something like this, a little scraper or something that you might use to scrape wallpaper off, comes in very handy. You can, again, this is quite a satisfying thing to do. You can just scrape it off like so, and once you've got it all off, oh, look at that, gorgeous. You can then dry that off and let it dry, and it's ready to have another piece of paper stretched upon it. Okay, now after presenting all that to you, I now very quickly present an alternative to all of that. I did mention it in class at some point that there is an alternative to paper stretching, and that is to purchase a watercolor paper pad that has the paper gummed securely in place. So you can get these pads where, this is an example of one, where the paper isn't loose or isn't just gummed to one edge, it's gummed all the way around, so it's secure like that, so it's kept taut like that. And you can paint on that and it will have a similar effect to being stretched. You can see this gum all the way around the paper like so there, and then once you're finished and it's fully dry, you can see there's one little part that hasn't got your gum, and you can put your finger in there and start to ease your sheet of paper out, or maybe very carefully put a knife in a little bit just to get it started, and then pull it away from there. Usually with these pads it's very high quality paper, and they're not cheap, and they're not abundant in like how many different kinds there are either, but they are an easier option than paper stretching. But what paper stretching gives you is much greater option in terms of paper. You can use all kinds of paper, and the shapes and sizes of your paper as well. You've got a lot more choice with, whereas certain brands do them, and there's certain papers you can get and certain sizes you can get, but you're ultimately limited in that range. So pros and cons with those, but that is an alternative. Okay, and that is the end of this video, part 2 of paper stretching. I realise that these particular videos are quite technical and sort of practical, and in these times of being stuck at home, as many of you will be, you may be looking for ideas for being creative and whiling away the time. So I'm very conscious of that, and hopefully the next few videos will be covering things that you can be doing more creatively as well. Okay, anyway, thank you very much. Keep well, stay safe. Thank you.